Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Night Watchman Society's event on immigration and freedom with Professor Chandran Kukathas. My name is Mitara, and before we begin, I'd like to give you a brief intro on the Night Watchman Society. We are essentially a meetup group that discusses a range of economic and socio-political topics through a classical liberal perspective. We host a monthly meeting, and this alternates between a book club and a public discussion like today's event. Now, through these, we explore critical ideas and issues pertaining to individual freedom and an open society. The Night Watchman also functions as the Untitled Society chapter of Sri Lanka. And now we have Dean, a member of the Night Watchman Society, who will begin the discussion. Dean?
Thanks, Mitara. Good evening, everyone, and welcome once again to the Night Watchman Society. The topic today is immigration and freedom with Professor Chandran Kukathas. The format this evening is rather simple. We are going to invite Professor Kukathas to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes. We then break away for Q&A from the audience for another 30 minutes or so, and we will try to wrap this up by about 6:45. So immigration and its implications on freedom is something that we wanted to discuss for a while at the Night Watchman Society. We see it often discussed in the West and in liberal democracies. It's a common and a familiar topic in US elections, UK and Europe and so forth, particularly in the past few years. But perhaps it's not a topic discussed as much or nearly enough in our part of the world, in this country in particular. Let me just give you one data point. Some folk from the University of Harvard a few years ago ran some growth diagnostics on Sri Lanka. And they came up with an interesting statistic about the state of immigration in Sri Lanka. So they looked at basically a statistic called the number of nationals per immigrant across various countries, right? So that is, if you walk on the street and you stop some people, how many nationals you find before you find an immigrant, right? So it turns out in Australia, for example, that a lot of us, Sri Lankans like to immigrate too. This number is about 3.5. That is, if you meet like roughly about 4 people, one happens to be an immigrant. Right? In the US, this is about 7. So roughly 7 people you meet, one is an immigrant. In Malaysia, it's 12.1, and Singapore, it's actually 2.2, and so on. In Sri Lanka, this figure is actually 535. So you meet 535 nationals before you meet an immigrant, right? So this is well before the pandemic, so that's not what it's driving that. So it's kind of, we have to admit that we lived in a fairly closed society. And I think it has very definite implications on our society, economy, the knowledge transfers and know-how, the network effects, and sort of the opportunities that it affords us, and our prosperity in every sense, and our economic growth. So today is not going to be a policy discussion focused on Sri Lanka, but a broad reflection about how we should think of this question of immigration and freedom. Our guest today knows a thing or two about this topic, not least because he has written a book recently on this topic. Our mutual friend Razin Sali, who introduced me to Professor Kukathas, told me that Professor Kukathas certainly knows a thing or two about immigration because he's actually born in Malaysia. He actually migrated to Australia, and he's, I think, an Australian citizen. And he did most of his work in the UK and in the US, and now he's back in kind of Asia. And today I believe he's joining us from Greece. So he's a man who kind of gets around quite a bit. But more than really than his personal travels, Professor Kukathas is someone who has reflected on these themes for a long time. And he's a highly regarded political theorist. So it's a great honor to have him join us today. So let me just formally introduce him. He's currently the Dean of Political Science at the Singapore Management University. Prior to that, he was the head of Department of Government at the London School of Economics for a long time. He has taught at the University of Utah, University of New South Wales, and ANU in Australia. And he's also taught at the University of Oxford, where he received his PhD. Professor Kukathas is a prolific writer, extensively published in leading academic journals and written multiple books on liberalisms and themes around it. Rawls, The Theory of Justice and Its Critics, Hayek and Modern Liberalism, and several works on the Australian political system. Most recently, of course, he's the author of Immigration and Freedom, the topic of our discussion today. Professor Kukathas, it's an honor to have you, and over to you. I think you're on mute. Professor, sorry, you're on mute.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, good. Well, again, thank you, Dean, for that very kind introduction, and I'm delighted to be here and have an opportunity to speak to your regular audience and anyone else who might be joining. You're quite right that I've moved around a bit. In fact, my grandparents on both sides migrated to Malaya from Sri Lanka around about 1910 to 1920, all at different stages. So while my parents were born in Malaya and I was born in Malaya too, I and three of my 5 sisters have gone to different parts of the world, and my 3 children live in Australia, in Canada, and in the UK. So we're really completely scattered about everywhere. So I should at least declare this, that my own biases reflect my own situation, that I've spent my time almost everywhere in the world except for where I was born, and certainly I've yet to visit Sri Lanka, which I hope to do. But living in other parts of the world, I always went back to Malaysia to see my parents. And then after moving to Singapore 2 years ago, I thought, now I'll come to Sri Lanka, but the pandemic has intervened, so sometime soon. Anyway, the topic of my talk today is immigration and freedom, and I take the title from the book I've just published with Princeton University Press. It came out about almost 4 months ago now. And I wrote it with primarily a Western audience in mind, more particularly with a Western liberal democratic audience in mind, because I was trying to address certain issues that were peculiar to those societies. But I do think that what I've got to say does have broader interest, so I hope this comes through in what I have to say. What I wanted to do was address a certain concern that people in Western liberal democracies had about immigration, and that was that immigration threatened the fundamental values of the society, because people coming from abroad will change the character and composition of society, but also bring in other ideas and other ways of thinking and other customs and traditions that would somehow undermine Western liberal societies. And so immigration control was presented as something that was necessary. I think what's been overlooked in all of this is the impact not just of immigration on a society, but of immigration control on a society. And that's really the main thesis of my book. The thesis is that immigration control is as great, if not a greater threat to the kinds of values that liberal democracies want to preserve than immigration itself. Now, why should this be the case? Well, the fairly straightforward answer to this is immigration control is mostly not about border control. It's not about controlling who crosses the border. Most countries, with the exception maybe of North Korea, want people to cross the border all the time because they want tourists, especially. Sri Lanka is a particular example of this, so is Greece. They want international exchanges, they want scientists to come in, they want trade, they want all kinds of things that border crossings make possible. So immigration control is mostly not about border crossing, but about controlling what people do once they've crossed the border. You want to control, most importantly, the labor market. You want to stop people from entering the labor market without the say-so of the authorities. They want to stop people who've entered a country settling, taking up residence in some way, marrying the local population, trading with them, going to university, doing a whole host of things that people tend to do. And immigration control is largely an effort not to prevent this from happening, but an attempt to control the way in which this happens. Now, my point is that you can't control this, you can't control the people coming in without controlling your own society, without controlling your own citizens, because your own citizens are all too ready to employ other people, to engage in trade with them, to rent to them, to let them open up bank accounts or enter college, or just to fall in love with them. So immigration control is primarily about controlling not outsiders, but insiders as well, because you can't control one without the other. So the more seriously you pursue immigration control, the more seriously you'll have to build a society that's dependent on institutions designed to surveil and control its own citizens. Now, some people may say this is fine because there are gains from immigration. And what I try to say in this book, that all the arguments that say that there are important gains to be made by doing this don't really work. The economic arguments are not convincing, the cultural arguments are not convincing, and the arguments that say that what we'll be doing is controlling our own society also are not convincing. So what I'm going to do here is present you with a summary of this argument, firstly by explaining why it is that immigration control is in fact ultimately going to be a danger to the freedom and equality of the citizens in a host society. And then I'm going to very, very briefly address two of the objections to my view, which say, look, there are still economic and cultural gains to be made, and I'll show quickly why these arguments don't stand up. And then I'll conclude by saying a few words about the ideal of self-determination. So let me begin. And the first thing to note here, of course, is that there is a fundamental question that has to be answered if we're going to address this topic, which is, what is an immigrant? Now, this may seem like a fairly unnecessary question because the answer is obvious. But the point I want to make here is that the critical thing to notice is that the word immigrant, or the term immigrant, does not identify a natural kind. There's no such thing as immigrants out there in the world that you'll find, like people of, let's say, a particular ethnicity, or people of a particular hair color, or people who speak, even people who speak a different language. I mean, these things you might just find independently. An immigrant, however, is simply a person who's defined as an immigrant. Right now, the UN defines an immigrant as someone outside his or her country of nationality for 12 months or longer. Not everyone uses this definition. Even within the UN, some agencies use different definitions. But the obvious question to ask is, well, why 12 months? Why not 6 months? Or why not 2 years? If you make it 2 weeks, almost every tourist is an immigrant, and the world is awash in immigrants. If you make it 2 years or 5 years, then there are many fewer immigrants. So the definition matters because governments, when they target immigration as an issue, they're usually focused on reducing the number of immigrants. But in one sense, of course, they could reduce the number simply by changing the definition. And that brings me really to the fundamental point. The first step in immigration control is in the way of definition. Now, let me deepen this observation a little bit further by drawing your attention to the fact that just as the notion of an immigrant varies and has varied from time to time, so has the obverse of the term immigrant, which is native. What exactly is a native or a national of a country? This too is not a natural kind. Someone is a native or a national just by definition. You're a native or a national in legal terms if the law says you are. Now, many immigrants have become nationals. I became an Australian national when I moved to Australia and took up citizenship. Everywhere I travel now, I travel on an Australian passport and I'm an Australian national. So immigrants can become natives, just as natives can become immigrants. But there's actually more to it than this still. Because the conception of an immigrant or of a national is a matter of definition, it is something that's been used by governments and states over the decades, over the last 200 years essentially, to determine not only who is an immigrant, but to determine who is a native or a national. And therefore, this is a process that can not only lead to some people being turned into natives or turned into nationals, but it can also lead to some nationals being turned into potential immigrants, or perhaps not even immigrants at all when they're stripped of their nationality. Let me give you one particular example of this, which touches on people like us who come from what was formerly the British Empire. Shortly after the war, we just take that particular period, that period before 1948, everyone who was a subject of the British Empire was a British national. Everyone who was a subject of the British Empire, therefore, also had the formal right to travel anywhere within the empire, because there were no border controls officially, not imposed by Britain. And they also had the right to settle and take up residence in the UK if they wanted. They were simply British. My parents grew up as British subjects, as my grandparents, and I imagine many people of my age in Sri Lanka also grew up or were born British subjects. Now, between about 1960 and 1970, all this changed quite dramatically because Britain became concerned as the empire disintegrated that many people would use their entitlement to move to Britain. They were especially concerned about this in 1970 when Kenya's Africanization policy threatened to see them expel all the Indians from the country, and Britain feared that these Indians would move to Britain, which they were perfectly entitled to do because they were still British nationals. So British law was changed slowly over the course of about 20 years to deprive all of these people of their nationality. So by 1981, all these people who were British nationals ceased to be British nationals. So the first step actually in immigration control, it's not border control, it's not even internal control. The first step in immigration control is classification. How are you going to be classified? Now, this may seem like a very exceptional example, but it's not. You can see the same story happening in different ways in the United States. For example, about 100 years ago, if you were an American woman and you married a foreigner, you lost your American nationality. Simple as that. So even if you were a white, native-born American with grandparents who were born in the United States, if you married a foreigner, you lost your nationality. So nationality is something that's not fixed, it's not stable, it's not natural in some way. It's a political outcome of a process. And this brings me to the second point I really want to make about this aspect of our understanding of nationality and immigration. It's a reflection not of any conflict between immigrants and nationals. It's a reflection of conflicts within a society among fellow nationals about how to regard each other and how to regard outsiders. And sometimes, as a result of the political victories of one side or another within a country, certain people can actually be turned into foreigners. And it's happened time and time again. So the first thing to think about with respect to immigration is to understand that this is not really a conflict between people within a society and people outside. It's not a conflict between insiders and outsiders. It's a conflict between insiders and insiders. Some of those insiders want people to come in, want them to be regarded as their fellow denizens or their fellow humans, and others do not want certain people to be classified in this way and be taken to be a part of their society. So that understood, those who want to control immigration, firstly want to control who is to be understood to be a national, and secondly, they want to control what is to be done about those people who want to enter or join a society. And this means what they will need to do is to control those people who are ready to welcome outsiders in. And there are all kinds of people who want to do it. Most obviously employers of all kinds will want outsiders to come in to work. This is the most common thing to be found. Indeed, most governments also want this, particularly in the countries of the developed West, because there is always a need for labor. Sometimes it's skilled labor, sometimes it's cheap labor, but for the most part, every country needs some kind of access to the labor market that is now simply a global market. The problem is that governments and many nationals themselves understand the need for the labor. They want the labor to come in, but they don't want to admit that labor is supplied not by robots, not by automatons, but is supplied by human beings. And human beings don't just come as factors of production. They don't just come as units with skills. They come with families, with commitments, with attachments, with tendencies to assimilate, to make friends, to become committed to a place, to fall in love with people. They find themselves with a need to return to look after their aging parents. All of these things are a part of the labor force that might join a society. So what governments have tended to try to do is to control people sufficiently that they'll get the labor, but they won't get all the baggage that comes with it. The trouble is, in any society, most people, in fact, get on with others, welcome others into their community, and develop stronger ties of affection and commitment that makes them inclined to associate with others in ways that governments or those particular parts of society that is hostile to people of foreign birth or from different parts of the world, they will be inclined to find ways to control all of this from happening, to prevent people from intermarrying, to prevent people from staying for too long, to prevent them from bringing in their relatives. Of course, they can't always do that straightforwardly because, particularly in democratic societies, the legal institutions, the laws passed by governments themselves often make this difficult. And so for this reason, it's going to be very tricky for governments to engage in any kind of activity to control outsiders without also controlling insiders themselves. And so this is why I think one of my concerns with immigration control is that ultimately it's going to mean much more control on people within a society. It means much more control over employers. It means much more control over educational institutions. It means much more control over banks, much more control over landlords, all of whom will have to cooperate with a government which has particular objectives that can only be achieved by controlling immigration in some way. So immigration control cannot but affect the freedom of citizens. Now, in the case of countries like Britain and the United States and Australia, I want to suggest that it cannot happen also without impinging on the equality of the citizens within the society. Now, why would you think this? Well, if you want to control immigration, one of the reasons people have for wanting to do this is that they're concerned about the kind of society they'll have. What kind of impact will immigrants have on the societies that are there? And also they're concerned about, the fact that people will in fact engage in activity to sustain, help, associate with outsiders. So you're going to have to develop legal institutions that are going to address this concern. You're going to have to get the police, the courts, the legislature, all of these institutions to try to address this concern that people will be coming in that you haven't got control of. This is going to be expensive. So governments have routinely been persuaded to try to use other mechanisms to try to stop or control immigration. Let me just give you one statistic to illustrate this. In the United States, between 1930 and 2000, over about 70 years, the United States deported 1 million of its own citizens. Now, it didn't do this because it wanted to deport its citizens. In fact, it has no legal right to do so. But it did so because at various stages, people in some parts of government or in some parts of various states felt that there were too many immigrants. And under pressure, state and federal governments set out to round up immigrants, mostly people who looked like they were Mexican, and deport them. Unfortunately, the people who are least likely to have ways of proving their own citizenship are people who are native born. And most of the Mexicans in question were in fact just native born Americans who'd been turned into Americans generations ago by the fact that the American state absorbed large parts of Mexico into the US. Some of you may realize that states like Arizona and New Mexico and California, all the way up to Oregon, were once a part of Mexico. When the borders moved, the Mexicans stayed. So there were many, many people of Mexican descent who were Americans for several generations, but they were deported because the anxiety and imperative to expel immigrants led to 1 million citizens actually being deported. So a large number of people were treated illegally and unequally because of the imperative to control immigration. And this, I want to suggest, is simply unavoidable. And to give you, another piece of evidence of this, even now, every year, about 4,000 Americans are wrongfully deported. That is to say, they're American citizens and they're deported because when you establish institutions of control, you do not always have control of the institutions. And so this will lead to enormous and ongoing injustice. Incidentally, the same is true throughout the European Union, which at any given time has in its hundreds of detention centers 1% of that population that is actually made up of EU citizens. So if you're setting up the goal of controlling immigration, you are going to end up controlling your own citizens, and you're going to control many of them in ways that are unequal and unjust. There is no way around this problem. The more seriously you try to control immigration, the more seriously you're going to control your own people, and the more likelihood there is of their being treated unjustly as they lose their freedom and become unequal before the law. And should people think, well, at least there are some gains to this, let me turn to two of the objections to my argument, both of which are grounded in the thought that of course there are costs to immigration control, but it's worth it. Okay? One argument is to say that there are economic gains to be made by controlling immigration. That is to say, we could keep our society wealthier, or we could make sure that the distribution of wealth within the society is fairer. In the United States or Australia and the UK, it's often argued, in fact, that the burden of immigration falls heaviest on the poorest parts of society, and all the gains go to the elites. They get the advantage of cheap labor, but the poor must compete with the cheap labor to their disadvantage. I don't think any of these arguments stand up. In terms of the wealth brought into a society, economically speaking, by immigration, there's simply no doubt that immigrants bring in more than they take. Even those studies that suggest something different suggest a loss economically because of immigration that is so small that it is hard to claim that it is statistically significant. But other things suggest a very different story too. Among people who are the most entrepreneurial in any society, immigrants stand out. And interestingly, the most entrepreneurial of all immigrants are refugees. In a sense, the most desperate people who come into a society turn out to be the most innovative and enterprising. So immigration does bring with it enormous economic benefits, many of which are hard to measure or quantify because they make themselves more strongly felt further down the track. But what about the concern that immigration control actually harms the poor, because the well-to-do get all the advantages of cheap labor, but the poorest tend to end up competing with immigrants and losing out, becoming either unemployed or seeing their wages fall. If you take a country like the United States, the evidence is a bit mixed, but no one thinks that the drop is anything significant. And that's before one takes into account that even though it may be the case that some poor do worse as a result of competition with immigrants, a lot of poor do better as a result, because many immigrants come in with skills that make it possible for other enterprises to flourish, which creates jobs for other poor. So to the extent that there's a conflict, it's a conflict among the poor. Some gain, some lose. But overall, the longer you wait, the more the gains to the host society. The burden of the poor is held mostly, in fact, by the most recent immigrants. They're the ones who find most difficulty competing with the newest immigrants. But in a sense, they don't really have a case because they themselves came as immigrants. The other thing to note about the argument about concern for the poor is that in many countries, the burden of immigration control actually falls disproportionately on the poor. And let me just give you one example. In the United Kingdom, in order to sponsor someone to come to the society, to enter Britain as an immigrant, one has to have a minimum income of £18,000 a year. As a consequence of this rule, every year, nearly 20,000 Britons are unable to reunite with their spouses. They're simply too poor to afford to sponsor their husband or wife to come into the country. And this is a burden that doesn't fall just on would-be immigrants. It actually falls on the poorest members of the society, and also, incidentally, disproportionately on women. So on the whole, the economic arguments for immigration control are really not very convincing. And I go into this in quite a lot of detail in my book, but in the interest of time, I'm going to turn to the next objection to my argument, which is the argument that, which is the objection that while immigration control may have its weak points, the thing is, we need to control immigration in order to protect our cultural integrity. Now, the problem with this argument is that in societies that already have a measure of cultural diversity, what it means is that you're going to have to say to many of your fellow citizens, we'll only invite in people who conform to a particular understanding of what a culture is or what our culture is. But if that society is even a little bit diverse, if it's made up, say, of different religious traditions or different ethnicities or different linguistic groups, you're going to have to say, well, we have this particular culture, in which case you're going to be excluding some of your own citizens from the definition of the culture that you're trying to protect. But if you said, no, look, what we have is a culture that's more capacious. It includes all these different people, all these different types. Well, if you do that, if that's the argument then you make, it's very difficult to justify excluding other peoples on cultural grounds because people are already diverse within the society. So it's hard to see how bringing in people of different cultures is going to change the fact that you've already got a society that's quite diverse. Now, it may be that you could make a stronger argument if you were a very homogeneous society, though even then, the problem will be that there may be people within that homogeneous society who are a little bit different, who want that society to be different than it is. And it's not really clear why it is that some particular group, or even the majority, should have a say in how that society develops and transforms. It's not necessarily an argument to say that you must change the society, but it's very difficult to say that some part of that society, some political element, should be charged with the responsibility for, and in fact, the right to say how the society goes forward as a particular cultural entity. And bear in mind that, every 50 years, if you look back into history, you will see with almost any society how different it now is compared to what it once was. If I think about people where I live in Singapore, they have far more in common with people in Britain than they do with people in China. And they have far more in common with Britons now than they do, say, with Singaporeans, such as they were 50 or 100 years ago. The world is a different place, and this is going to be the case probably forever. So to say that somehow the cultural basis of your own convictions about what a society should look like give you some kind of warrant for keeping it the way it is simply implausible for two reasons. One is that you simply cannot achieve this in any case. And secondly, it's not clear why you should have any warrant for doing this. Let me then turn finally to the third consideration I want to discuss in wrapping up this talk. And that is the argument that immigration control is important for a society because it's a way of its expressing its right to self-determination. We decide who we are. We're like a family, or we're like a home. What I want to say here, firstly, is that actually a society is not like a family. It's not like a home. If you think it's like a home, well, maybe you have the right to control who comes in if you're just living in a one-room apartment by yourself, and you claim the right to turn anybody away at the door. That seems fair to me, unless the building is burning and you want to exclude the fireman. I don't think that's reasonable. Okay, but if it's a two-person family, well, you can have a rule that each party has a veto on who enters, but I think it'll probably be, a little bit more polite to your partner for each to give the other, the right to invite in whom they want. Though maybe, be careful if you're going to invite your mother and father-in-law to stay without asking. Okay, but let's say you're living in a group house with, 4 or 5 people, as many students do. If you had a rule that says everyone has a veto on who is invited in, or every invitation has to be decided with a majority vote, I think it would be a less pleasant place to live. But now, supposing you're talking about a condo or an apartment complex, and you had a rule that says before anybody can invite anybody in, there had to be a collective vote by the whole condo. Maybe not even a rule that says everyone has a veto, but everybody has to ask permission. I think it's very unlikely that anybody would obey this rule, because most people will start to think, well, this is actually none of your business who I invite in. My little flat may be my home, but my condo is not our home. We just share this area. Now, think about this if you're thinking about not just a condominium or an apartment block, but you're thinking about neighborhood. Would you want to say that everybody in your neighborhood had the right to exclude? Think about it more broadly still. It was a city. The further out you go, the less something is like a home, and the more it is like a group of people who have some connection, but also have their own lives, and they want to invite people in as they see fit, without being bothered by other people trying to tell them their business. Similarly, with the idea that a state or a nation or a country is like a family. It's not like a family. Families, and families don't decide how the family grows and develops. Okay, a family, if it's made up just of husband and wife, maybe they can decide for themselves if they want to have children, but it's probably no business of grandma, an uncle, a cousin, who comes into the family, whether you have any more children, whether you decide to adopt. That is really largely your business. Families are very different, they're varied, they can be nuclear, they can be extended. A country is not like a family. If it is, it's probably a very, very peculiar family. And like in all families, there are probably one or two people you don't really want to have much to do with and you don't want in your business. So home is not like a family. Rather, a country is not like a family. It's not like a home. It's a different kind of form of association. It's a form of political organization. And in a free society, people have rights to determine for themselves at least some important parts of their lives, such as who to associate with. Now, the other thing that I'll say in conclusion about self-determination is that the idea that immigration control gives you self-determination also has to be understood as slightly misleading, to the extent that immigration control is no longer just a matter of a country determining for itself who comes and who goes. Most countries are party to international agreements, to treaties, to refugee conventions, and to an international system of management that is itself the institutional structure for immigration control. Whether you're the United States or the European Union, your ability to control immigration is dependent on your agreement with one another through these international institutions. So the idea that you just have self-determination when you're exercising what rights you've got to control immigration is simply misleading. If you wanted to deport someone, you can't just deport someone to nowhere. You've got to deport someone to a particular country. That means you need the cooperation of the other country. So at the very least, that part of immigration control is a two-way thing. In many cases, it actually involves far more actors than just the two countries that are immediately involved. So immigration control is not really giving you self-determination. And if you want an example of this, think about the European Union. Okay? All 25 countries of that union are a party to an agreement that allows free movement within its borders. To that extent, all of these countries have given up the right of self-determination with respect to migration among 25 different countries and two others who are also in the Schengen area. There's no self-determination there, although there's another sense in which there's self-determination, if you want to call it that, to the extent that the EU tries to control with limited success its external borders. In doing that, of course, the countries internally cannot dissent from that. They've lost their own capacity for self-determination of those rules and those regulations, and they are party to an agreement that they themselves cannot change without leaving that union. So the whole idea that self-determination is what you get from immigration control, I think, is deeply misleading. So with that, let me just finish and say, I think, in summary, that the main points I want to make here are that immigration control begins with classification, and this is something that impinges not only on outsiders, but also on insiders, that immigration control is control, and this means control not just of outsiders, but of everyone. And thirdly, that immigration control has to result in people being treated unequally, not just outside, but within a society. And the three arguments that say all of this is worth it, in the end, simply don't stand up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kukathas. So we'll now break into Q&A. If you are on a Zoom call, you can use the Q&A feature to type in your questions. We already got a few. If you are on our Facebook, you can just leave your questions on the comments, and somebody will get it to me, so I can ask that question for you. So let me just kick off with the first question we have. So other than the kind of objections that you mentioned, another perhaps a third or a fourth objection is that immigration controls are justified in terms of the welfare state. So if, for example, a country has a very generous healthcare system, that is sometimes used as another argument against why we shouldn't let immigrants in. So the question is, does it not have a justification to a generous healthcare system, for example, does it not have a justification to exclude others? Wouldn't making such schemes contributory help overcome this rationale? So if a welfare system is more paid for by its citizens, does it make this argument less potent? So yeah, that is the first question.
Yeah. No, that's a good question, and one I actually address in quite a lot of detail in my book. There are a couple of things to say here. Firstly, in very general terms, there's actually no empirical evidence that this has ever happened anywhere, that welfare states have, as a result of immigration, found themselves in difficulty because they're bringing in or attracting large numbers of people who are overwhelming the system. In fact, I can give you one rather dramatic example of massive immigration that took place to a large welfare state without causing the kind of disruption that people fear. And this is in 1991, when West Germany was then absorbed all of East Germany. And East Germany, as you would know, was a former communist state that was as poor as they come in terms of everything from its infrastructure to its skills, and with a population that was very staunchly anti-capitalist in its mentality, with very few skills. So Germany, of about a country of about then 60 million, absorbed about another 15 million people at a cost of 100 billion American dollars a year for the next 20 years. And still, Germany remains a very, very prosperous country. So the systemic worry about this, I think, is not really a serious worry. But there are a couple of other things to consider too. Most immigrants actually don't want to move in order to become dependents. When they're fleeing societies that are highly controlled, as many refugees are, they don't want to go back to a society in which they're going to promote these ideas. They tend to be more independent. So that's why immigrants tend to be much more entrepreneurial and refugees more entrepreneurial still. So the likelihood that immigrants will, in fact, take up the opportunity simply to sponge on the welfare state is very, very implausible in principle, and there's simply no evidence of this happening. But the other thing to bear in mind is that when a society admits immigrants, there's absolutely no reason why they have to give them all full welfare rights from the beginning. To give you a very personal example, when I moved to London in 2007 as a professor at the London School of Economics, I had what was called then a work permit for 5 years. And as a part of the condition of my work permit, I was not allowed for 5 years to get any welfare services. That is to say, I was paying taxes in the UK, and as anyone who's been there knows, those taxes are pretty hefty. I had access to the healthcare system, but that's because I was paying generously in terms of taxation, but I had no right to unemployment benefits or a range of other benefits for the first 5 years. This is a very simple mechanism for controlling access to the welfare state, if that's really your concern.
Thank you. So we have a lot of questions coming in. So another question is related to another argument against the sort of, say, more open borders, is that due to kind of brain drain, people from the poorer countries loses out when richer countries open up, because all their smartest people immigrate out of that country. So how would you deal with that argument, and what's kind of the empirical evidence on this?
Yeah, there's a lot written about this, but on the whole, the evidence is that the so-called brain drain, far from being a loss to the countries sending out their people, it's actually something that's more often than not a benefit to them. People who leave often do because they cannot deploy their skills to greatest effect wherever they are. They're going abroad in search, as often as not, of an opportunity to use the skills they have. The other thing is that they tend to go to places that are wealthier, and they send back remittances to the societies from which they come. And the amount of money going back to host countries in remittances from immigrants sending money back home is several times as great as all of the money spent in foreign aid in all countries in all the world. So the sending countries do in fact receive a substantial amount of income from the people that they're exporting. The other thing to remember too is that it's not as if the countries that are sending out workers simply have a fixed supply of workers. We've got, the Philippines sends out thousands of people as nurses every year, but the Philippines is not running out of nurses, okay? And one reason for this is that nursing is in fact an export industry in the Philippines. People go to train as nurses because they know that they can make a living in other parts of the world as Filipino nurses, and as their qualifications, experience, and quality become more widely known, they go out in larger numbers. There's also more incentive for domestic institutions in the Philippines to develop this industry further, to train people, to improve their facilities. So I think one is going to be very careful about making the brain drain argument. And bear in mind also that this is just a short-term phenomenon. In the long term, it's leading to a greater equalization of incomes across the world, which I think can only be of benefit to poorer parts of the world, which are still much, much poorer than the countries, the average country of the developed West.
Thanks. So another question coming in is that are countries that have realized the economics of the immigration control not convincing? That is, that I assume they have realized that it's good. Are there examples of countries that have changed policy? And if at all, are there countries that you would consider models of immigration controls?
I don't really want to set up any country as a model, because all the countries that I know of have very different immigration policies. And even single countries have had different immigration policies over the decades, going back, more than 100 years. Immigration policies tend not to be stable. So, if I were to say that such and such a model country is a model, I'm worried that 2 weeks later could be quite different again. But I think most countries have their immigration policies shaped not purely by concerns that are well-founded or as a result of careful economic analysis. Policy is often made in response to pressure from particular groups, sometimes even quite small groups. I mean, for example, and this applies not just to immigration control, but also to trade more generally, a political party that's wanting to get into office but needs to win parliamentary seats in a particular part of the country may decide that, they're not going to lose many votes in other parts if they toughen immigration restrictions, but that part of the country may really want them for whatever reason they think it'll benefit them. So they might be quite willing to hold the rest of the country hostage to this particular section because this will give them an electoral advantage. Over the years, immigration restrictions reflect this kind of politicking rather than any concern by political parties in office or in opposition, sitting back and saying, okay, what is the optimal policy? What is going to maximize our economic benefit and minimize the economic or other costs? That's never the case. So there have been times, for example, when Britain, in the period when it was an empire, had relatively open an immigration policy. Australia, on the other hand, has always had a very restrictive one. Until the late 1960s, it had what was called the White Australia policy. So you couldn't move to Australia unless you were essentially European or American. That changed dramatically in the 1970s. But in the 1970s, they were very, very welcoming of refugees, even though there were a few pockets of dissent. Now Australia is very hostile to refugees for reasons that is very hard to understand, given the small numbers involved and all the advantages that they bring. So no, I wouldn't want to hold anybody out as a model. Different countries have good policies in some respects, but very questionable ones in others.
So let me then ask you a follow-up on that in terms of kind of models of immigration policy. So there is some set of countries that seems to me have a kind of a rules-based model where you would have certain criteria that is well set out, and anybody can kind of compete to attain or fulfill those requirements. And others are more complex. So in the United States, for example, it's very different to how you can, for example, get residency versus perhaps like in Australia or Canada. So I know you may be reluctant to sort of say what is better, but you have a general sense of like, at least to me, it seems like the rule-based one is actually in some sense set and impartial. Is there a kind of your thinking on that?
Yeah, so I think maybe what you're referring to is something that's sometimes called the point system, which places like Canada and Australia have. So they set down a number of criteria, and if you meet them, then you're more likely to get the right to immigrate. Although it looks like it's impartial, it turns out that the rules actually are not, because they're also designed to exclude certain kinds of people. It's still much more difficult, for example, for people in Africa to get even a tourist visa to come to the UK or to Australia. Quite difficult for people in India to get a tourist visa to go to Australia if they are at a certain age or in a certain status. There may be official rules that that look like they're impartial, but in the end, I think if you look at them closely, they're actually not all that impartial. They're discriminatory in various ways. The other thing that's just worth noting by the by is that often these point systems are designed to encourage the immigration of people with particular skills. And governments like the Canadian or the Australian, sometimes the British, although I'm not sure about the British, set out list of preferred professions where they know there's a shortage. It turns out that actually they don't know when there's a shortage, because they only find out about the shortage after it's happened. By the time they change the rules to allow people to come in to fill that shortage, the enterprises in question have already found other ways around it or closed down. And now there are new shortages and new surpluses. Governments can never be, up to the mark, because the only way they have of setting out these lists of required skills is by doing surveys, which are out of date by the time they're completed. The market actually does a much better job of signaling where there's a shortage and where there's a surplus. So on the whole, I don't think the point systems are actually very good ones. They give the impression of being impartial, but they're actually not. They're just another tool of control.
So another question that we have here is about integration. So a big complaint is that these immigrants don't integrate into our society. I think you kind of touched on it with the home example, but do you not see that there can be certain cultures that prefer to kind of be insular and does not integrate well with society, and that can be potentially a problem?
There's certainly a tendency for some communities to want to be more insular, to be more disengaged from the rest of the world, and that includes the rest of the nation. I'm not sure why this is a problem. I mean, for example, if you take the United States, there's a lot of talk about, let's say, Muslims, people who might come and be insular. But of course, there are large populations of other kinds who've been quite insular. There are, for example, people like the Amish community who've been there for centuries, who pretty much keep to themselves. There are very Orthodox Jewish communities which keep very much to themselves, don't engage with people outside, but want to cleave to their own traditions. There are people who have ended up keeping more to themselves because they've been deliberately excluded. So the descendants of slaves have, in many parts of the country, found it difficult to integrate. It doesn't seem to me that this is, in fact, the problem that it's sometimes taken to be. To the extent that you want to have greater integration, I think it's sufficient simply to make sure that people aren't deliberately excluded, because people's natural inclinations is, in fact, to associate with those around them. Even those who come in with, very particular cultural traditions will find over the generations that fewer and fewer of their children actually want to live in isolation from the rest of the world. And that's not just true in, say, countries like the United States or in Australia. It's also true in countries like Iran, for example, where, even though its leadership is very conservative and its population is predominantly, more than just predominantly, almost exclusively Islamic, the younger generation is also familiar with the rest of the world and with its freedoms and its other customs and so on. And they also want to strike out, on their own. So the idea that you can somehow control all of this, I think, is, needs to be taken with a grain of salt.
So we have another question on kind of communicating the benefits of liberal immigration policies. So the question I asked, Professor Rohan Samraji was asking, like, Singapore has greatly benefited from liberal immigration policies, but even there, there is still opposition to ever more immigration. So, so there are recent charges that the government is letting into immigrants. So he's asking, does this not show that the benefits of immigration really does not communicate well to people other than a small kind of educated elite? And if so, my follow-up question would be like, what are some of the campaigns, or what are some of the arguments that you think have worked in terms of making societies more open in this respect?
So in the Singapore case, the government generally has been much more in favor of immigration. But again, bear in mind what I said before, is that it's because they want workers. It's what they want, the skills that people bring. It doesn't necessarily mean that they want people to come and settle. And this has changed, over the years. 20 years ago, some moved to Singapore. They were very anxious to give them, residency quickly and citizenship, because they wanted to keep those people with the skills. Now it's relatively easy still to move to work, to get a work permit, or even to get an employment pass, but much harder to become a permanent resident, even harder to become a Singapore citizen. So, the extent to which the government is pro-immigration varies quite a lot. With respect to the population, there are definitely parts of the population that want less immigration, but there are also parts of the population that want it to continue because it is to their benefit, to their advantage. And I think Singapore, like many countries, faces a situation in which these forces are at tension, and these are political forces at work. So the outcome will be, to some degree, a reflection of various political calculations. I don't know what it'll be in 20 years. It may be quite different. It may be much more nativist, if you like, or nationalist, and much less open to immigration. Or maybe it'll be less nationalist and more open to immigration. Very hard to predict. The only thing I can say is that the outcome will invariably be be one that's the result of the resolution of political tensions in one way or another. And to that extent, you might ask, well, why are you bothering to say all this if it's all political? Well, political arguments do depend upon some consideration of the intellectual issues in play. It's just that the intellectual issues and their answers don't simply determine the course of events. There are other things that are equally, if not more powerful factors.
Okay, so there are a couple of questions on like Sri Lankan immigration policy that I won't ask you. But just I think the general arc of the question, I think, is related to the one you just answered. It's about like countries like ours. I think it's about kind of getting to a more liberal immigration policy. So currently in Sri Lanka, the question says that immigration regulations don't allow spouses, foreign spouses of Sri Lankans to work, for example. So that's a big problem we have in this country. There's kind of difficult to get dual citizenship. So in small countries like ours, which are kind of middle income, low middle income, that kind of country, what will it take other than sort of, well, it's all political, but other than sort of what does it take to kind of move beyond that? Is it so that as societies get richer, they become more open, or is it kind of something else? How do you kind of unravel this problem? How do you begin to unravel it?
I think what's probably going to lead to change in a more open direction will probably be seeing the results of other countries being more open and seeing how they take advantage of the gains that are made from having different immigration policies. The example you gave, for example, of spouses not being able to work, that makes a big difference. You know, if I had to move somewhere and my wife, who's also a professional, couldn't work, we wouldn't move. Okay, or if it were the case that we did move and she found that she couldn't work and she was stuck at home or doing something, you know, simply as a hobby, well, you know, the society would lose that particular set of talents. Eventually, you know, those people will probably just leave, in which case you're depriving yourself not of one, but of two sources of talent. Now, if you're extremely rich, you can probably, you know, bear that cost. You know, if the United States had that policy, which, you know, to some extent it does, because it makes it quite difficult for spouses to obtain the right to work. It doesn't come automatically, or eventually people can usually find ways to get sponsors and so on if they've got high skills. But still, you know, in small countries, the cost that they will pay is very high. The former Lee Kuan Yew, the former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, once observed that, you know, Singapore has only got the capacity to produce a limited number of, you know, great violinists, even though there are plenty of people with, you know, with musical talent. This is a country with 3.5 million people in a globe of 7.5 billion. If you're going to go shopping in, you know, in only the street which has, you know, 0.05% of the world's population, you're going to miss out. I mean, you know, you may find people, you know, there's you know, in 3.5 million people, you'll find people with some talent, but the chances that all of them will be the best that you could get is pretty small. So smaller countries, especially, I think, take a real risk if they want to, you know, close their borders. And remember, closing or opening borders is never a yes or no question. It's always a matter of degree. Okay, you can have you know, a country that's more open with respect to just letting in tourists, but if it's not allowing them to take, you know, take a job, to settle in other ways, then they've only got the borders open to a limited extent. If they open the borders and allow people to come into work but don't let their spouses work, well, the borders are a little bit more closed than they would be if their spouses were also able to work. There are all kinds of ways that borders might be open. Actually, to give you a practical example of this, of how varied the rights you might have having crossed a border, if you are a Commonwealth citizen and you move to the UK, if you're actually taking up residence there, you immediately have the right to vote in national elections because you're a citizen of the Commonwealth. Okay? If you're a citizen of the EU, when Britain was in the EU, you did not have that right. Okay, so the border was more open in one respect to citizens of the Commonwealth. On the other hand, it was more open in another respect to people in the EU because they could move back and forth freely without needing to get permission to reside. People from the Commonwealth, if they move to Britain, actually have the right to stand for Parliament even before they become full citizens. In the US, you have to be a full citizen before you have that right, and so on and so on. So rules about the rights that you have as an immigrant are very varied, and there's no natural answer to what it should be. A lot of this is the product of history, some of it is the product of contemporary politics, and unfortunately, a lot of it is not purely rational, but it's the outcome of you know, conflicts and tensions among people seeking to get their way.
Okay, I think we've got through most of the questions. Just a kind of a final one from me in a related way. I think we kind of keep circling back. How do you kind of begin to move into a more liberal regime? Suppose somebody is in favor of it. Like if you want to advance this argument, you kind of mentioned in passing that some of the economic arguments are not that convincing to people. So what is the argument that you feel will convince people or more people? Of course, it's a result of some political process and negotiation, but having kind of watched this evolve, do you see that a particular kind of argument is actually more important?
I don't think there's any single argument or single strategy. Of course, as a university professor and writer, the only strategy that I have is to write and make arguments. I don't think arguments themselves will win the day, but they're a part of the story. Okay? There are others with different skills, those who are in politics, for example. Well, they may have to adopt different strategies. They may have to make compromises on some things in order to push for outcomes in another respect. My contribution always will be to try to address the concerns that are put in the form of arguments, to try to understand them. Firstly, of course, that's the most important thing, and then to try to see whether they hold up and then explain why they don't. And then all I can do is hope that through various fora like this one, another person is persuaded not to just accept my view, because I think anyone who could be convinced by one podcast can be unconvinced by another one. All I really want to do is to try to get people to think through things in the way that I'm suggesting, not take arguments for granted, but think of them as the starting point for further reflection before you make up your mind.
Okay, so I think we covered most of the questions, so I think we're running out of time. So Professor Kukathas, thank you so much for joining us today from your holiday in Greece and sharing your views. The book is called Immigration and Freedom, and you can get it from places that sell that kind of book, and certainly from, it's available on the Kindle store, which is where I got it from. So I hope you read it. Once again, thank you, Professor, for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
So the Night Watchman Society holds monthly meetings, rotating between a book club and a talk like this one. Given the pandemic situation, we have moved to online meetings like this. But if you'd like to attend one of our meetings, just email us on info@nightwatchmansociety.org. You can find more information on the Night Watchman Society on the nightwatchmansociety.org website. We are currently reading a book on how China became capitalist by Ning Wang. That is a book that we're currently reading. If you would like to join for that session at the end of this month, please email us. We're also the local chapter for the Bastiat Society. So the friends from the Bastiat Society, thank you for joining us. So I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.